what we've come to learn in the last, particularly, say, the last 2 decades, is there's more to vitamin D than this classic endocrine system that we're always trained on. This is what controls vitamin D activity. So we know it's actually involved in the immune system, for example, and so the requirements for, say, optimal production, optimal health aren't necessarily the same for uh, regulating calcium as what they would be for these other activities of vitamin D in the body.
Welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show. My name's Barry Bradford, and today I'm excited to welcome Dr. Corwin Nelson to the show. Corwin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Barry. I'm excited for this opportunity.
Corwin is an associate professor at the University of Florida. He studies a lot of things. We'll get into some of that, but one thing that I think is cool is he did his original training in biochemistry and might be one of the few biochemists that's out there teaching students in dairy farm evaluation today. So he's obviously got a pretty broad range of expertise. Corwin, first of all, why did you end up going into biochemistry for your undergraduate degree?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll actually take it back a little bit further than that. I actually didn't even want to go to college out of high school.
Okay.
My parents convinced me to do the Farm and Industry short course at the University of Wisconsin. So I've talked to a few people that were instructors there before. I think I may be the only one that has gone on to graduate school. There's a few veterinarians that came out of that program, but most of them, went back to the family farm or some aspect related to dairy there. So I actually didn't even want to go to college. Once I started, though, I haven't left.
So you obviously grew up on a dairy. Tell me a little bit about the family dairy, if you would.
Yeah, so it's East Central Minnesota, just north of Minneapolis, St. Paul area, about an hour and a half. We had 52 Holsteins in a tie stall barn is what we milk cows in. So I grew up milking cows. That's what actually, my wife and I, when we got married, that's what the plan was, to keep milking cows. Well, my brother decided he was going to milk cows too, so I let him have that. And actually, the reason why I ended up in biochemistry, I went to undergraduate thinking medical school.
Okay.
Because I didn't want to be a veterinarian. I saw what our veterinarian did for work and decided that I wasn't going to do that. The pay is not great for the amount of work. This isn't against anything of veterinarians out there. I didn't want that job.
Yep.
So a couple years into the undergraduate program that I was at in Minnesota, I decided I'm going towards biochemistry, and I wanted graduate school to go along with that. So that's kind of my background in biochemistry, how I got started there.
Asepsis, an ounce of prevention. Asepsis LLC is a Wisconsin-based animal wellness company focused on the development of state-of-the-art animal hygiene technologies. Our company's mission is to apply innovative hygiene solutions into animal agricultural and veterinary applications, improving the wellness of the animals with a focus on sustainability. We accomplish this through the continued enhancement of our chlorine dioxide-based technologies within a wide range of agricultural hygiene applications, from facility and animal hygiene to water treatment.
Okay, so then you ended up doing a PhD at Iowa State, a postdoc at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then you've been at University of Florida on faculty for a little over 10 years now. Is that right?
Yep. I came here in 2013. It's middle of 2013, so 10 and a half years ago. Came down to Florida.
And talk me through your areas of responsibility there at this point.
Yeah, so I have a research and teaching appointment here. So 70% research, 30% teaching. So on the teaching side, I teach one undergraduate course on sustainable cattle systems. It's a small course, experiential learning, get students out on the farm. They have to spend 30 hours during the course of the semester, either at one of the farms or come up with a project that they, related to cattle systems. So it could be beef or dairy. A lot of the students either pick milking cows or feeding calves. Those are the two most common projects, and they really do enjoy it. They enjoy the opportunity to get out there, and it's great to hear some of the stories of their perspectives. Most of these kids are kind of from metro areas in South Florida, so Miami, Orlando, Tampa, and those areas.
Yep.
So this is a great experience to get them out on the farm. So that's on the undergraduate side of teaching.
What year in their program do they typically do that? I'm curious.
Typically, they're juniors or seniors.
Okay.
A lot of our students come in as transfer students. They've already done a couple of years, so it's most of them have been juniors or seniors. So that they come into
Okay.
for that particular course.
Yep. Okay. So then most of the rest of your responsibility is research. Is that correct?
Yeah. So a research appointment. A lot of it is, we can get into this later, but a lot of stuff on vitamin D. That's what I started out as during my PhD work. Dissertation was on vitamin D, and my postdocs on vitamin D, and most of my publications have been on vitamin D. So I've done a lot. I've branched out from that, so I know a little bit more outside of just vitamin D. But that's been the majority of my research.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that. And I think breadth is great, but I think it's been great to have somebody, frankly, that's early in their career, or at least modestly early in their career, focusing on vitamins, because it kind of fallen out of favor. There's not many people working in that space, and we certainly need to learn more. So can you give us, some of the people listening, I'm sure, don't think about essential nutrients every day. Help us remember maybe what we learned at some point about why vitamin D is important, what's its role in the body.
Yeah, so what I forgot to mention in my teaching side. One of the things I also do is teach a vitamins course for graduate students.
Okay. Yep.
One of the parts I enjoy about teaching vitamins is the history behind vitamin and mineral research. And this is the great tie into dairy, is a lot of the discoveries that were made for the vitamins are actually made because they recognize milk contains these nutritional factors that were not glucose, or not energy, protein, or fat, right? So
Right.
they weren't carbohydrates, not protein, not fat. What were these other factors? So eventually, a lot of the minerals research was discovered from that. Tied into the single grain experiments that were done at Wisconsin. That was part of it. So the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's a lot of the agriculture experiment stations, including at Michigan State University, but a lot of them were conducting these experiments to identify what were those nutritional factors, those micronutrients that were required for growth. So vitamin A, which is the first in this series that was discovered, realized it required for normal growth, and also vision, obviously, that was discovered from it. But then vitamin D was shortly after, and they knew it was this fat soluble factor. But there's experiments that were done that they realized that if you heated it, it would the anti-rickety properties, so the properties that prevented rickets, is bone deformation. If you heated the fat soluble portion from milk, that you'd still retain that anti-ricket property,
Okay.
but the attributes of vitamin A, so the vision, right, the night blindness, that would be destroyed. So then they realized there's another property. So that goes all the way back to how was vitamin D discovered? It was they realized there's a factor, a fat soluble factor that prevented rickets, which we then eventually discovered is very critical for maintenance of calcium
Okay.
homeostasis, and so proper skeletal development. And so from there, there's a whole field of research that developed, through the 30s and 40s, 50s, looking at that relative to milk fever in dairy cows. So a lot of what we know about vitamin D is really discovered in relation to control of calcium and prevention of milk fever in dairy cows. And so that took place through all the way up through the 80s and 90s. There's still a lot of work that was done on it. We're still continuing some of that today.
Yeah. Great. So just bigger picture, right? The classic, like you said, the classic sign of vitamin D deficiency was rickets, where typically a young animal has basically curved bones
Yep.
from poor mineralization, right? So probably nobody, I would guess, at least in developed countries, has seen a calf with rickets in their life, or maybe a few people, very few, right? So maybe you could say, well, we we must have figured out vitamin D. We feed it, right, and we have prevented that issue. So what's the evidence that we still have a gap there in terms of meeting vitamin D needs at some point in life?
Yeah, as you pointed out, we've kind of solved the part of we know how much an animal needs to prevent rickets.
Yeah.
That was actually I had to dig around for a bit to find this data. It was actually presented in the Journal of ADSA meeting back in the early 1930s. So I found an abstract that gave the amount of vitamin D that was required to prevent rickets in a calf. That value has been used actually across species. It's quite fascinating. 6.6 IU per kilogram body weight.
Okay.
It's really what that comes down to. That value has been used, and we know that's enough to prevent rickets. On the side of prevention of milk fever, there's a lot more that was done. How much is needed to actually support calcium homeostasis in a lactating cow? So that was done, in like the 40s and 50s. There's some research done on that. What we've come to realize, probably in the last couple decades, uh, vitamin D does much more than just contribute to regulating calcium and phosphorus. It's involved in many aspects of tissue development. It's involved in the immune system. It's involved in gut physiology and so on. So there's a lot of and reproductive physiology. So there's the vitamin D receptor is present in nearly every tissue. So what we've come to learn in the last, particularly, say the last 2 decades, is there's more to vitamin D than this classic endocrine system that we're always trained on. This is what controls vitamin D activity. So we know it's actually involved in the immune system, for example, and so the requirements for, say, optimal production, optimal health aren't necessarily the same for uh, uh, regulating calcium as what they would be for these other activities of vitamin D in the body.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so like you said, some of your work at least has been on um, milk fever. And again, just to make sure we're on the same page, talk me through the way we frame milk fever today, or if you want to talk about subclinical hypocalcemia, that's fine.
Yeah, and so it's a fascinating aspect, I think, to this the link to vitamin D here, and they milk fever, what we classically define it, it's a clinical milk fever. It's a downer cow, right? And
Yep.
and that historically was a massive problem for dairy farms. Is we developed these breeds that were high producing dairy cows, and so this is a massive problem that researchers are really working to address. 100 years ago, and through the early 1900s, where a lot of research that was conducted on this. One of the biggest, I guess, solutions that was developed, and it really started to come out in the 1970s, 80s, was the concept of feeding these low DCAD or negative DCAD prepartum rations. That was very effective in preventing milk fever. And so with that, we essentially, I'd say, not completely solved, but really solved the issue of milk fever per se.
Yep.
And that we to where farms now may see under 5%, right? So if a farmer, even now, if they see one case of milk fever, they're calling up their nutritionist trying to find out what's going on here.
Yeah.
Why do we have this case of milk fever? So it for, really we've solved that issue of clinical milk fever. Now, it was probably about 10 years or so ago, maybe a little bit more than that. This idea of subclinical hypocalcemia is actually a paper by Tim Reinhart, really kind of brought out with this aspect of subclinical hypocalcemia, the fact that cow still has low blood calcium.
Mm-hmm.
She's not displaying any signs of clinical hypocalcemia, but she has low blood calcium. And so from that, what are the consequences of that? And so there's some work around 2012 13, and so that started to make some associations with subclinical hypocalcemia and impaired transition cow performance, lower productivity, lower reproduction, associations with metritis, impaired immune function, and so that's something that really all of a sudden became, hey, we haven't addressed this issue completely. We've
Yeah.
solved the milk fever problem. There's still this aspect of subclinical hypocalcemia that was about 10 years or so. So a lot of the research in the last decade, I say, has really been geared towards subclinical hypocalcemia.
Okay. So, um, as that field has drawn, more interest and more people investigating, I think there's been some nice insights into different strategies, right? That may be beyond DCAD. Um, what are you thinking about the most right now? I know you've worked with a different form of vitamin D. You have some interest in inflammation. Where are you looking forward in this space today?
Yeah. So maybe to tie on a little bit of that, some work out of Cornell that came maybe 6-7 years ago. It's around
Mm-hmm.
2017. I think it was maybe the one of the first publications that Jessica Picard's group had on this was the different types of subclinical hypocalcemia. So for a few years there, we were just kind of classifying all subclinical hypocalcemia as the same. And they started realizing, well, it's not all subclinical hypocalcemia is the same. There's types of what they call transient versus chronic or persistent or delayed hypocalcemia. And the difference was, like a transient, you'd have a cow that have milk blood calcium that would have that typical decline, and then that cow would rebound and she would produce just fine and be a high producing dairy cow, very very high performing animal. Whereas you'd have these other cows that have delayed or persistent hypocalcemia, and those were the problem cows. They were the ones that had higher incidence of metritis, producing less. Um, they're the cows that have lower reproductive performance, or a greater incidence of ketosis, and so on. So
Yep.
we started to realize it's not all subclinical hypocalcemia is the same. So we need to look at um, this from the dynamics of subclinical hypocalcemia. We also need to consider that. So that's one of the parts that I've been looking at more recently. The other part that you mentioned was use of vitamin D, and that's where that ties in very closely now with subclinical hypocalcemia and the different types.
So talk to me about that, will you? So vitamin D is actually not one compound, right? So maybe we should start there.
Right, right. That's a very good point. So when we say vitamin D, we actually it's oftentimes a very general term for a number of different molecules that are very similar. So it's similar to like vitamin E, like you say vitamin E, but there's actually a number of different molecules that have differing activities. So vitamin D, the main form that most animals have, that we have in our bodies, that cows would have, it's called vitamin D3 or cholecalciferol. Right, so that's what we take in the form of a supplement. That's what we give our cows as a supplement. It's also what's synthesized in our skin. Right, so if down here in Florida, where we actually still have sunlight,
Rub it in.
uh,
Yeah.
and yesterday is cloudy, but we have nice sunny days. We get that plenty throughout the year, probably more than what we want during the summer months
Yeah.
for sun exposure. But that's what's formed in our skin. Cows do the same thing. They produce a lot of vitamin D in their skin if they're outdoors. We've kind of jumped around that aspect for dairy cows because we just supplement vitamin D3. We ignore the part of that really they're able to make it in the skin. We just supplement vitamin D3 in the diet. So that's the form that's fed to the animal, but that's not the active form. It has to undergo two metabolic steps to become the active form. So the first one occurs in the liver, and generally that's been thought to be just a high throughput process, not really regulated. So that's going from vitamin D3 to this next one would be 25 hydroxy vitamin D, also known as calcidiol. And so that's what circulates in our blood. Still not the active form, but it's the substrate to the enzymes that make the active form. So the next one would be calcitriol or 125 dihydroxyvitamin D3. And that's the very potent, like, it's a hormone, right? So it
Yep.
has very potent calcitropic, or stimulates an increase in blood calcium, blood phosphorus, that you see. So it's a very potent hormone. And so the body really regulates production of that particular hormone very, very tightly. So what we found recently for dairy nutrition is we can feed this 25 hydroxy D, or the calcidiol, instead of vitamin D3, which is the precursor to that. What we normally put in there is vitamin D3, but the animal has to do a couple activation steps.
Yep.
And it's the calcidiol, or the 25 hydroxy D, is much more effective at increasing the levels of that substrate in the body, right? And so they've done this in poultry for a number of years because of absorption. What we're finding in cows, it's partly due to this regulation of that activation.
Okay.
And so we're able to, and this is approved for use in ruminants now in the U.S., I think South America, most South American countries it's approved. I think in Asian countries, I believe in Europe, it'll probably be approved for use in ruminants there fairly soon too. So it's globally, it's becoming a one of those novel approaches to feeding prepartum cows now.
Interesting. And are those typically, are you able to feed less of that 25 vitamin D3 versus just the cholecalciferol because it's already gone through that first step, or how does that typically work in terms of a feeding rate?
That's a good topic for another experiment that we
Okay.
actually need to. So you could feed much less of this to achieve a similar amount of that 25 hydroxy D that's circulating in the blood. So yes, you could. We haven't really done that experiment per se in lactating cows. We've done it in
Okay.
calves, and so you could feed a much smaller amount in calves. Like to give a comparison, in bull calves, we did this. So we could feed about half the amount of the 25 hydroxy D and still get greater serum 25 hydroxy D concentrations than we could just feeding the normal vitamin D3 that we typically put in diet. So yeah, you
Okay.
could feed it much less. Now, what the research that we've done so far on like for prepartum cows, we actually feed more than what we typically have for vitamin D3 in the diet, because we're trying to really push that those serum 25 hydroxy concentrations even greater
Okay.
during
Right.
that close-up period. Normally, for normal productions, you wouldn't want to go that high, but we're trying to really drive them greater during that close-up period.
So how does that strategy interface with this newer concept of there being different types of hypocalcemia? Is it particularly good at preventing the transient quick drop after calving, or is it interacting with the more chronic situations?
Yeah, so that first part of it, the transient hypocalcemia, it does not prevent that. And so
Okay.
we actually did an experiment here. It's almost 10 years ago at Florida. We published it in 2018, where we did a combination of low and or negative and positive DCAD with with calcidiol versus cholecalciferol, so normal vitamin D3 versus the 25 hydroxy D.
Yep.
And so with the 25 hydroxy D, you're able to really increase that serum 25 hydroxy D, like I mentioned before. And so if you did that in combination with the positive DCAD, it did nothing for preventing that really significant drop in blood calcium.
Okay.
So the low DCAD what was the critical factor
Yep.
in preventing that, say, transient hypocalcemia that would occur, right? And so we're talking of borderline clinical milk fever. I mean, their serum calcium, I think, was down to, I mean, it's close to 1.6 millimolar. So these cows were just on the border of really crashing and developing milk fever.
Yep.
So that was when they had a positive DCAD. So the elevated serum 25 hydroxy D from feeding calcidiol did not prevent that.
Right.
But then what we found is, in that early time point, it didn't have an impact, but it did affect that kind of delayed or that recovery from that over time.
Hmm.
So in our more recent experiments, and even looking at the one that we published in 2018, where we see a difference is at, say, day 4, day 5, and so on, you start to see a difference in serum calcium concentration from feeding calcidiol at that point.
Interesting.
So I guess to get back to the dynamics of transient versus delayed or chronic hypocalcemia, it doesn't impact the transient hypocalcemia, but it does affect either the delayed or the chronic hypocalcemia.
So how do you explain that? What's the biology there? How does it affect one aspect of that, do you think?
I wish I had a clear answer at this point. Hopefully, we can get to that in the next few years. So, there's a couple possibilities. One is it's it is increasing the calcium absorption mechanisms of the intestine, right? So we actually have some data in support of that. Prepartum, it does have a small but noticeable impact on total tract apparent digestibility of calcium
Okay.
during the prepartum. We weren't able to measure that postpartum in our one experiment, but prepartum we know that it does have that impact. It does increase along with during prepartum for your cows that are fed a low DCAT. It does increase urinary calcium excretion. So it is creating this greater flux of calcium prepartum.
Okay.
That's one of the things that's playing into it. Now, that alone doesn't prevent that transient hypocalcemia.
Right.
It may help that cow's ability to then recover. So it helps change that recovery process, so they're able to climb out of that hole even faster. That could be one of the ways. The other way, it could be tied to inflammation.
Okay.
So one of the things that we've learned in the last few years, or because I think we knew this before, but it wasn't really considered as a key thing, is the role of inflammation in hypocalcemia. So it inflammation does, I guess, perturb that condition of hypocalcemia. So the mammary gland is the big reason for hypocalcemia, right? The draw of calcium for lactation.
Yep.
So that's a big reason. But if a cow develops inflammation, that actually draws the process out even longer. And so, and we've done other experiments. So, like if you do a intramammary LPS challenge, or you do an IV LPS challenge, we know that blood calcium it decreases for a time there. The other thing that's tied in very much to this, you also know from a cow has inflammation, or a cow for metritis, for example. A cow with metritis is going to eat less, right? So if a
Yep.
cow is eating less, that they're just whole ruminations are down. The cow's not taking in as much calcium to meet those demands. So it's part of it's the inflammation is uh, just in not looking at a transition cow, for example. Any animal, there will be a slight hypocalcemia that occurs with it. Say an endotoxic shock, for example.
Right.
The other part is animals eating less. So that perturbs that hypocalcemia even more.
Okay. So, do you know where does calcium go in an inflammation? Let's say you induced it with LPS, and so it's not necessarily like she was already eating less or she already had a disease going on. You can see calcium drop pretty quickly. What do you know about where it's hiding?
Yeah, so it's actually the tissues soak it up, and it's just a kind of so the body actually doesn't excrete that calcium during that time, so it's not necessarily lost. Like with clinical hypocalcemia in a postpartum cow, right? That there is a loss of calcium to the mammary gland to milk
Hmm.
synthesis, right?
Yep.
With inflammation, that's not necessarily lost from that inflammatory event. The tissues will soak it up. So we don't have direct data from cows per se in this, but from other species. There's a wish I had the reference to the paper, but I blanked on it now. But there's a paper done in pigs actually where they did a endotoxin challenge, and then looked at where calcium went in the different tissues. So it really the tissues sequester that. So liver and lungs are a couple of the major ones that will. The peritoneal cavity, it's soaked up there. So that's where that calcium is going. Once that animal recovers, that calcium is then restored to circulation.
Okay, interesting. So back to the results you have with 25 hydroxy D3, you said there's evidence that it helps to prevent that sustained or that longer term hypocalcemia, and maybe better absorption is part of the story. Do you think that vitamin D treatment, that 25 hydroxy D3, could also be somewhat anti-inflammatory, or what other mechanisms do you think might be in play?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we're looking at more closely now is looking at indicators of inflammation. We don't have data on that specifically yet, but in general, one of the things that vitamin D is known to do in the immune system is help control inflammation or contain inflammation. I don't like to use the word prevent so much, but
Yeah.
contain that inflammation, right? So inflammation is a necessary process that needs to take place to resolve infection. But like we know from COVID, for example, you have inflammation out of control. It's very damaging. Um, and that's one of the things that vitamin D is known to be involved is help provide the checks and balance to that or to that inflammatory process. And so that's when you look at potential role, and we don't have direct evidence for this yet, but one of the potential ways that 25 hydroxy D is helping to, I guess, improve that delayed or chronic hypocalcemia or prevent that, it's through controlling the inflammation that's there, which theoretically is quite conceivable because vitamin D is known to have this anti-inflammatory role.
Yeah. I mean, that opens up a whole series of questions, right? About like if some of these conditions in transition cows that we've been fighting for 100+ years are really physiologically sort of interlinked. If you can, maybe there really are silver bullets that can sort of help at the base level. Have you looked at sort of long-term outcomes from feeding transition cows 25 hydroxy D3? Like, do you see improved reproduction or things like that that might be downstream of inflammation and other conditions?
So the best indicator we have is milk production, right? So that's
Okay.
been a consistent finding that we've had. I didn't mention this earlier, but consistent outcome that we've seen is increased milk production. And so some of our work that we've looked at our data now and see, okay, there is an association or interaction there with metritis.
Yeah.
So that's something that's become apparent. And so the increase in milk yield seems to be linked to cows having less severe metritis.
Okay.
That's a part of it. So we consistently see this increase in milk production, right? So we've in a couple of our studies up to 4 kilograms or 8 pounds per day
Wow.
in milk for
And this is
the
just
first
with
several
feeding
weeks.
it. Sorry, and this is just with feeding it before calving, or are you going into the fresh period as well?
This is just feeding before calving,
Okay.
right? So the I guess caveat to that one is there's just a study done at Miners presented at animal science meeting this last year. They saw it wasn't as large of an increase in milk production, but they saw an increase in milk production from feeding the 25 hydroxy D prepartum. But in there, they had much lower incidence, really relatively healthy cows. These are high producing cows. I think
Okay.
they're producing 50 kilograms per day, in that first 6 weeks or so. So, high producing cows, very low incidence of health events there prepartum. So it seems to still get this increase in milk production even without inflammation. But I think where we see a much larger impact then is when you look at cows that had a a negative event, and metritis being the most common one. So, right, cows that
Okay.
have metritis, um, they performed better if they had been fed 25 hydroxy D prepartum. So there's a lot of interactions that are taking place there. We don't know them completely yet. We're just we're learning more and more as we dig into this data of potential modes of action.
Sure, that's really fascinating. So where are you going next? What's the next? You kind of alluded to one or two studies, I think, that are in the works. What's the next big question you're trying to tackle in that space?
Yeah, so one of them, we are taking a closer look at the interaction or the influence that we'd have on inflammation. So looking at indicators of inflammation like haptic globin, is that impacted by vitamin D status in animals? So we're looking at that from our trials with that we've fed 25-hydroxy-D. We're looking at a kind of broader, just observational point of a larger commercial herd trial that we've done, and so those are a couple of things that we're looking at. Also trying to understand where else is this 25-hydroxy-D acting in the body. So that's another angle that we're looking at. And then I think this is kind of broadly outside of vitamin D, just understanding these transition cow problems that we've been looking at, from uh, energy balance of a cow, fatty liver of a cow, to hypocalcemia. What are the problems what are the roots of the problem that we need to be focused on, and what are symptoms that are there versus what are causes of conditions, right? We're learning more of that in recent years, and I think we're getting closer.
Yeah, it's a complicated chicken and egg story, isn't it?
It
It's
is.
very
It is. I
different.
mean, I'll take the example of hypocalcemia. You could do the same thing for blood BHB, but so for example, we know low blood calcium, it does impact immune function, right? So
Yep.
if you decrease blood calcium, it'll have a negative effect. Or I shouldn't say negative. It impacts the immune system, right? We know that. We've done the experiments to do that. Calcium is required by the immune cells.
Right.
There's a clear association between hypocalcemia and metritis, that we know is there. Is it the low blood calcium that's causing that, or is it the metritis that is continuing to perturb the situation?
Right.
So those are some of the things I think we're getting a better picture of it, but we don't have necessarily the straightforward evidence to say what's causing what. And in reality, I think there's still interaction taking place, right? So
Yeah.
um, just like the chicken
It's
and egg,
easier
you got to
to
both are taking place, right?
it's
So
easier to set this up as an A or B, but often that's a false choice, right? It's
yeah, and
both A and B in many cases, right?
I think you could say the same thing for blood BHBs and
Yeah.
NEFAs, for example, right? We know that they have negative impacts, right? So on certain aspects of physiology, fatty liver, for example, that has impacts on hepatic physiology.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we define what's necessarily bad for an animal versus is it just normal physiology? It's not just a clear cut answer of here's when it's bad, here's when it's not bad. Um, it's an exciting area that we have going on in I guess transition cow research right now. That uh, I think we have a lot of opportunities to really make improvements in how we manage transition cows, how we feed
Absolutely.
transition cows, how we worry about what issues to really focus on,
Right.
and do we need to be bringing every cow through for health checks, right? Is that going to be required to do that? How do you narrow down and um, focus on the animals that truly need the help?
Yep. No, I'm excited about that too. Well, you work at a university. It gives you the chance to dig down into the deepest details of this kind of stuff, but you also interact with people who are very different fields, right? So one of the questions we like to throw at people, if there's one thing, if you've got a 2 minute, a break in a building and somebody finds out you're a dairy person, what's the first thing you want them to learn to understand about the dairy industry?
Yeah, let's say let's say I'm talking to somebody that's outside of dairy, right? Friend somewhere, somebody that you meet along the way, and they ask,
Yeah.
and uh, first thing, how valuable dairy is to say nutrition, right? To feeding the world. We can talk about that amongst ourselves all the time, and internally, I always talk about that. But uh, it's such a valuable food commodity, dairy as a commodity in general. And when you look at it, this has been recognized for thousands of years. The good example to give is the what they call it, the development of lactation or lactase persistence, for example, right? And
Yeah.
how the population just flourished along with the development of that particular trait. And this happened in not just in Europe, but happened in multiple different regions. So, dairy has been a big part of nutrition, and this is why I like teaching this in vitamins too, because how did we discover all the vitamins? A lot of it was really attributed to they recognized there's nutrient factors in milk that prevented a lot of these, rickets, night blindness, what were required for normal growth of animals. Um, it's attributed there to dairy. So we have uh, this what many might argue would be the perfect food in dairy. Uh, that's a great nutrient, and it's fun, right? Cows are fun to work with. Maybe some days they give you headaches, but cows are fun to work with, and dairy farmers are um, great people to really for our society. They do a lot of great things for conservation. They're not everybody is making an effort all the time, but more and more, we see our top dairy producers. They want to be making an effort, along the lines of conservation too.
It's time for our famous three. Maximize profitability and herd health with early detection in animal health, reproduction, calving, and feeding. The most advanced bolus technology and professional support from agricultural experts makes this possible. SMAX Tech, the health system that future-proofs your operation.
All right, we've got our 3 questions we throw at everybody.
Okay.
We want to hear, first of all, what your favorite dairy-related book or resource is.
Yeah, so the ones I find myself reading the most, not a book per se, but I guess dairy magazines that would be out there. So Horde's Dairyman, Dairy Herd Management, and Progressive Dairy, for example. So those are key things. It's just kind of good to keep a broader scope of what's going on in the dairy
Mhm.
industry, current status of what's out there. Um, you, the hot topics of the day.
Sure.
They'd be out there. Certainly, Journal of Dairy Science would be one of those other ones that's more scientific related, but the others are kind of more of just in general dairy production news that are out there. So those would be my, say, top dairy resources that I go to.
Okay. What about your favorite book or resource outside of ag?
Yeah, so there one that I read recently is Atomic Habits. I think did I mention that? Right? Yeah, Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a book that just kind of goes into how do you develop, say, a lifestyle that is. So when you look at, say, people that are very productive people, how do they get to the things that they do? A lot of it's just taking small steps, right? Making
Hmm.
little changes as far as we brush our teeth all the time, so obviously you learn that one young, right? Our
Yeah,
parents teach
hopefully.
that one
Yeah.
wrong, right? So things like that, but we learn that habit at a young age, but then there's other ones that we have to pick up over time, such as healthy eating habits. Well, how do you develop the types of eating habits that you have? Well, sometimes it may be just little changes that take place that really change that. So like, for example, my wife and I, we get up and take a walk every morning at 5:30 in the morning. So some mornings would rather sleep in than do that, but you're pushing each other. So but it's one of those that, hey, we we need to push each other to get out and be active and do things. So, but it's a lot of times so what there's in the point of the book is it's not say a New Year's resolution that you're making. It's hey, this is a small change I can make right now that has a difference, and then you make these incremental changes that are
Yeah, good.
achievable.
Yeah, it's more achievable and more sustainable, right?
Yep.
All of a sudden, I'm going to run a marathon every day tomorrow,
Yeah.
January 2. That's good. Good thoughts there. Okay, last question. In your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
Yes, that's I guess a fun question for me too. Is thinking of the last several months I was able to spend time up in the Northeast region, New York and Vermont, and get to visit a number of dairy farms and visit different dairy producers, and and you look at what has differentiated those that are successful. Their business is going to continue versus those that aren't, and a lot of it just comes down to being really good managers, managers of the resources that they have, the people, of the cows, of the land. They just have what it takes. They pay attention to the details, or work together as a team to be able to pay attention to those details. So maybe they can't get every aspect, but they develop either themselves or as a team approach, the ability to really take care of the details and really manage things quite well, from every aspect of the dairy operation. So that's what I'd say kind of separates them apart, along with having a vision for the future, right? You have those that are looking for ways to be innovative in what they're doing, right? So they're not just going to sit back and, well, this is the way we've done it for the last 20 years. We're going to continue it. They're looking for ways to be innovative that are, there's some risk involved with it, but they're also not taking that unnecessary risk in that. So, those things I think are really what have set apart, those that are going to continue on to the future and be successful versus, those that, not every dairy that closes doors because of poor management, but there's an aspect there of we've seen a lot of them close. Either they didn't have a vision for the future and what they needed to take, or just making most of all the resources that they have. So.
Yep. Sounds like a consistent theme there is develop a vision and then use small atomic habits to achieve perfection, right? Or not perfection, but better outcomes anyway.
Yep. Efficiency, right? Developing efficiency. Yep. Making the most of what they have. Yep.
Corwin, as always, I enjoyed the conversation with you today. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Yes, it was my pleasure. Great to chat with you, Barry.
We'll have to start planning the next one soon.
All right, thank you.
All right, this has been another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. If you haven't already subscribed, don't forget to hit that button so you don't miss the next episode. And until next time, see you around the bend.